And just so I get kind of a little bit of a lay of the land, how many of you attend church regularly? Okay, that's kind of what I expected, so that's good. The age range, I think, was not what I expected, but that's great. I love that you guys are all here to learn about all of this stuff. So as you mentioned, I do write some books, and I'll have some for sale later and so on. But this is a talk that I've not given before, and it's sort of like a combination of two books, right? I've written Thank God for Bitcoin, and my newest book is Fiat Ruins Everything. And this is sort of like the missing chapter. This is a chapter that I wanted to write, How Fiat Ruins Churches, but I didn't actually write that chapter, and I kind of regret not doing it. But you guys get to be the beneficiaries. I'm going to talk about how fiat ruins churches and, what incentives there are and so on. So just to give you an overall idea of what I'm going to be talking about, and by the way, I have no idea how long this lecture is going to take. It's possible that it'll take like an hour and a half. It might take 35 minutes. I don't really know. I'm just going to kind of wing it, and we'll see. But here's the agenda. First, we're going to talk about fiat values and what they actually are. It's kind of like the water we're swimming in. A lot of people don't really recognize exactly the value system that they have. And if you read sort of like older writings from a different era, you'll often sort of like come up against that. It's like, oh, okay, those are some assumptions that they had. It's harder to know about our own assumptions, and I'll try to sort of elucidate that a little bit. Second, we're going to talk specifically about how fiat ruins churches, the specific incentives at play that cause churches to maybe act a little differently. And third, we're going to go into some of the consequences of what that does. So if fiat does ruin churches, how does it actually ruin it? What actually happens? And finally, we're going to talk about Bitcoin and specifically what values it presents and how that is going to, how that changes the incentives in a church and hopefully fixes a lot of the problems that fiat puts in there. So that's our agenda. That's sort of like a map of where we're going. All right, so let's get started with fiat values. What are fiat values? Like I said, these are sort of the intrinsic values that we kind of take for granted. So one of them is something like debt-based building, right? That's something that a lot of organizations, businesses, even individuals, they do that, and it's because we have easy money. It's because of fiat money. It's this idea that the money is very easy to produce, and that causes building to be based on debt. Second, there's trust in money, and this is very pervasive, and it's largely because the money is centralized, and there's sort of like this desire to trust it because, okay, this is the hammer that we have, and we're going to see everything else as a nail. Third, scale over quality, and this is because the money is constantly debasing. And as I'll show later, scale tends to be the way that things go because everything is debasing, and instead of quality, you get just lots more units. And finally, you get a lot of outsourced virtue, and we'll talk about exactly what that means. But basically, it's this idea of political engagement being a substitute for individual virtue. All right. So let's talk about each of these things and exactly what I mean. All right. So debt-based building. So generally, profit and savings is too slow in a fiat economy. This is generally how, for ages and ages, how people actually build businesses. It's you save and you buy something to expand your business. If you have profit, you reinvest it in your business and so on. This is how you grow your business. That was how it was done for a long time. People figured out debt is a little bit faster. If you can get loans, then you can expand your business a little bit easier and you can scale faster and so on. And that's nice. And as long as the debt incurs an opportunity cost in somebody else, this works fine. Except with fiat money, the debt doesn't have an opportunity cost. So you sort of like lend out money all over the place. And this is the problem. Fiat money is really Latin for "let there be," right? Like let there be money. It's money that is coming into existence, and really all money in a fiat economy, at least a central bank-backed fiat currency, is debt-based. This is how money comes into existence. This is one of the things that most people don't really understand. They think, okay, when I get a loan from the bank, when I get my $400,000 mortgage on a $500,000 house that I put $100,000 as a down payment for, where does that money come from? In school, what we learn is, well, the bank basically has depositors that deposit at 3% interest. You pay 5% interest on the mortgage, and the bank makes the difference, right? That's what we learn. Okay, so the bank makes 2% on $400,000 or something like that. But that's not how it works at all. The actual way it works is, first of all, that doesn't make any sense at all, because the term is too long, the amount is too big, and the interest rate too low for that to actually work. And if you do the math, there's no way the local bank branch can afford 47 vice presidents with that kind of money, right? It just doesn't make any sense. So how does it work? Well, they create the money into existence. They print it into existence. This is what's called fractional reserve banking. So when you get a mortgage for $400,000 on your $500,000 house, that money comes out of nothing. It is printed on your behalf. And it's not just mortgages, it's your credit card debt, it's commercial loans. So the entire commercial bond market operates in this way. So when a company needs a loan, they'll issue some sort of bond, and commercial banks buy those bonds by issuing money out of nothing because they have the liabilities on their balance sheet. And of course, the federal government does the same thing. When they have a budget deficit, their budget is $6 trillion, their tax receipts are $4 trillion. Where's the other $2 trillion? Well, they sell some of the treasuries into the market, but if there's a gap, that goes on the Fed's balance sheet. And this is where money comes into existence. All money comes into existence in a fiat economy through debt. So the thing about debt-based building is that it's essentially bringing forward consumption, because when you're printing money or creating new money in order to fund this building, you're essentially kind of stealing from everybody else. But you're also bringing a lot of consumption forward. The investment that you would do, you would have had to do like 10 years on if you were using savings and profit. You can do right away, but that profit like never appears because you're bringing forward consumption, and that causes that means that there's a lot of malinvestment. Oftentimes, if you do use debt and everything is fine, then like you're able to have the same income, or the business plan works exactly the way you expected. Things are fine. But if anything goes wrong, well, then there's malinvestment. And this often happens in a fiat economy. You have money going into industries that didn't work, and you have a lot of wasted time and effort as a result. All right, so that's debt-based building. That's one of the 4 fiat values. Second one is trust in money, and the basic idea here is that there's this mentality that all problems can be solved by money, right? All problems can be solved by money. And this is a pervasive mentality in a fiat system. And you could kind of tell by like an especially rich person, how much money do I have to pay to fix that, right? There are some things, especially as Christians, that we believe can't be fixed by money, right? Like money is not going to save your soul, for example. But this is sort of like the thing that a lot of people sort of subscribe to. As a result of this, this mentality is a result of the fact that you do have the money printer, and money is the one hammer that is available to any government. And of course, when you have a hammer, you see everything else as a nail. Okay, I can solve this with this hammer. And you never think about the, situations where a hammer doesn't make any sense. But that is how, this system works. So as a result, you get monetary incentives and greed kind of dominate everything because everybody thinks that money will solve it. Like that's the mentality that everyone gets into as a result of fiat money. So there's this economic concept called Homo economicus, and it's this hyper-rational, money-driven person, right? And that's the sort of basic unit that Keynesian economics sort of uses as, okay, well, now we can figure out aggregate statistics and so on. It's based on this idea of Homo economicus. Really, it's this idea that their only value is in money, and they put a price on absolutely everything. And it's that same assumption that goes into a lot of the policies and thoughts that people have. So as a result of that, there's a lot of lobbying of the money printer, because if somebody has this ability to solve your problems, well, then you're going to lobby that entity as much as you can. And as a result, you get a lot more politics injected into everything. And you can kind of see it right now. Everything is political because everything is about getting the money and getting the money printer and having your problem solved. And there have always kind of been a lot of status games. Any community that you're in, you're going to have some sort of status game there, right? Like, well, somebody's at the top, somebody's at the bottom, and there's jockeying for position and so on. But when you have this money thing, that becomes a dominant status game over everything else, and that's a dynamic we see as well, where that's pretty much like the only measure of how successful you are in many circles is how rich you are or how well you've done in that. And one of the subtle things is that it means that there's a neglect of providing value, right? It's not about providing value to other people. It's more about how much money do you have, and however way you made it, does not matter. So think about somebody like Warren Buffett. A lot of people respect the guy. Why? Because he's rich. The guy has not built anything in his life. He's moved money around for his entire life. That is his quote-unquote super. He hasn't done anything. But he's at the top of this status ladder because that's the game we're all playing. We all trust in money. All right, so let's talk about this third one, scale over quality. And this happens, this is due to this thing called inflation. And there's two types of inflation that we should really talk about. The classical definition is monetary expansion. And this is how much of the money there is and how fast it's expanding. But the current definition of inflation is something called the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. And I'm sure many of you have seen those numbers and you're like, wait, that doesn't look right? Well, I can tell you that the CPI is a heavily manipulated metric. There are at least two huge fudge factors that you can sort of turn the knob on, the hedonic goods adjustment and the hedonic quality adjustment. Could get into that sometime if you want to. I do at least explain one of those in Thank God for Bitcoin. But essentially, it's a manipulated metric, and it almost always comes in, 3.5%, 2%, something like that, right? Like so somewhere in that range. The monetary expansion rate you can actually measure. The St. Louis Fed has the M2 money supply numbers starting in 1959. 1959, the M2 money supply of the U.S. dollar was $289 billion. Currently, it's right around $22 trillion. And if you annualize that and get the compound annual growth rate, that ends up being about 7%. So 7% versus like 3.5%. What's going on? Why the difference? Well, there's always sort of a natural deflation to technology. When you have new processes or something like that, you have better computers or you have, better transport methods or something like that, you get you get an improvement on those. So you can think of the difference as sort of like the target that every company has to engage in. So there is something called the phenomenon of sticky prices, and it's really based in this desire for predictability that we have. When we're paying a certain amount of money for something, we don't want to be paying more of it, or we get shocked when there's a higher price, and most people sort of just refuse to buy it, or a lot of people do, enough so that companies try very, very hard not to raise the prices. So when you have sticky prices and inflation at the same time, well, there's a lot of tension there, right? The monetary expansion rate, again, is 7%. So you have to get like a 7% improvement in processes or costs or something. Otherwise, your prices go up, right? Like you can't run a business. So the dilemma ends up being, well, okay, how do I get that? And there are sort of like natural technological improvements that you're going to get. I don't know, maybe you're using a better POS system and you reduce like theft from your employees or something or whatever. But ultimately, the way that they've found that's most consistent is by scaling up, because you spread your costs over many more units. Well, that makes it cheaper, and you see that's one way in which you can do that. But 7% is a lot. So what do you do? Well, you can just sort of cut corners, right? Like you can use cheaper ingredients, or use like less quality control, or outsource to China or something like that. And that is indeed what ends up happening. So what you get are giant companies dominating every industry, right? And you can go to any industry, accounting, there's like 4 large companies. You can go to technology, there's 4 large companies, right? Microsoft, Apple, Google, Facebook, something like that. You could go to health insurance. There's like 5 big insurers. You can go to food. There's like 5 big agricultural companies. Everything is dominated by these enormous companies. And the U.S. is actually pretty good by having a quintupoly. A lot of countries, it's like a monopoly or a duopoly. It's really not very many. There just isn't that much room. The U.S. is a very large economy, so you have room for that. But giant companies generally dominate as a result of inflation. And you have this tendency towards large scale rather than having better quality on things. So we all end up kind of feeling like cogs in a machine, right? Because you have these giant companies that dominate the economy. Well, now if you're going to get hired by them, it's not your local butcher that is hiring you and you get to know them and so on. It's instead you're like a number in a corporate office, and that's kind of where you get as a result of scale. It's very dehumanizing. And in addition to that, there's fragility in the entire system, because once you scale up, any part of that supply chain, if it gets disrupted, everything gets kind of crazy, right? Like you can't produce it and so on. And we saw this during COVID, where you had supply chain problems. Why? Because, well, a lot of things got disrupted, and all of a sudden you couldn't get chips out of TSMC, and no cars were able to be produced, and so on. All right, and the final fiat value that I want to talk about is outsourced virtue. And this is the idea that voting for programs that sound good are the same as having personal virtue. And kind of blame Catholic social doctrine a little bit. But the idea is that if I vote for X, that's as good as me doing X, right? And X might be feeding the poor, or sheltering the poor, or helping somebody. And voting for programs kind of is in that realm. And you get kind of credit for group achievements. So if my group did this, then okay, now I get to feel good because my group did this, right? And that sort of points to this idea that when you have easy money, like, you have easy virtue. It's not real virtue, it's fake virtue, but you can sort of like act like you did do it. And this leads to a lot of tribalism. right? Because if you get credit for being in a particular group, and your group did something virtuous, then you want to belong to that group. And you have to signal that you're in that group, and you get virtue signaling, right? Which is this idea, okay, like I belong to this group, therefore you can't criticize me because I get credit for whatever I am in that group. And because it's not individual-based, because it's group-based, you get more degeneration because people are not growing in virtue. It's groups that get credit for certain virtues. All right, so to summarize, these are the fiat virtues, right? Like fiat values. Debt-based building, and that comes from easy money. You got trust in money, and that comes from sort of the centralization of the money. You get scale over quality because the money is constantly debasing. And you get outsourced virtue because the money is very political. All right, so how does this affect the church? Well, fiat ruins churches, and I'm gonna talk about exactly how. All right, so debt-based building, this is one of the fiat values that we talked about. This enters the church. Well, how does it enter the church? Well, most churches have very little patience for saving or building slowly. And if you've been in any church where they're running some sort of capital building program or talking about expanding or whatever, like this is all they talk about, right? The how can we get more people in here? How can we do more ministry? How can we? And that leads to a focus on large capital projects. And I don't know if you've ever been in a church where they're doing like a building campaign, but man, do they come after you pretty hard, right? Like they usually cook you dinner or something, and it's like, oh, here's our vision, and give you like nice architecture diagrams, and here's like they do like 3D renderings and all that stuff, and you're at the end you have to like fill out a pledge card saying I'm going to contribute $400 a month for the next 2 years or something, right? Like this is where it goes. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, but what happened to patience, right? Like, why do you have to get this right away? And what's going on here? Now, like at some level, this is due to fiat money. You have a money that is constantly being debased. But that's not necessarily like what Christ preached, is it? Third, there's a large component of servicing debt that comes into every church. And you can see this in any church budget. Okay, how much are you paying for your mortgage? If you just had a capital raise, well, now that's a big part of your budget now. And guess what? If you have a church split, good luck paying that mortgage. Not going to happen, right? A lot of churches then end up in a paycheck to paycheck situation, right? Where you have a large staff, right? And I don't know, maybe you were getting a little less popular because another church opened a new building down the street or something like that, and now you've lost a bunch of your flock. Yeah, it gets very difficult, right? Anyone that's lived paycheck to paycheck knows that just one wrong thing, you can get into some serious trouble. This is happening at the church level. And that means that it's an existential risk, right? When you take on debt, when it's debt-based building, and things don't go exactly according to plan, you're dead, right? And I've seen this story in so many places where you raise for a big building, you raise, $2-3 million, you get that giant building, and, there's a congregational split or something afterwards, probably arguing over what the building should be like or something. But, there's a lot of existential risk around this stuff. And even if you paid off the building like a few years ago, there's sort of like a focus on the building itself. And that's but ultimately, everything is based on theft, and it's not a good foundation to build a church, because that money that you borrowed for those capital projects, based on the pledges that you got from your congregants, which is essentially bringing their consumption forward, right? Like bringing their paychecks, right? You're relying on congregational income to fund your stuff. It's based on That's not a very good foundation. You're clearly violating the eighth commandment. All right, so another of these fiat values that penetrates the church is this trust in money. And like I said, it's this idea that all problems can be solved by money. And, we give lip service, I think, to Christ and saying, I trust in God, I trust in his provision and all that. But I'm going to give you a couple of counterexamples. All right, kids. So this is a question that I like to ask a lot of young couples when I'm at church. And, maybe they just got married, maybe they have one kid or something like that. Okay, when are you going to have kids, or when are you going to have your next kid? And a lot of times they'll say, well, we can't right now. What's wrong? Why can't you? Oh, we can't afford it. Have you ever heard this? Who's heard that, had that same conversation with people? All right, you've heard that, right? So what are you actually telling me if you're saying you can't afford it? Well, what you're telling me is that if you had more money, you would have the kid, but you don't, so you're not. That if you had more money, you would be able to take care of a kid, that more money is what you need. And this is at church, guys, right? What are we supposed to be trusting? We're supposed to be trusting God. It's not the extra money would take care of this kid, right? I can now afford more babysitters. Maybe I can afford a new car. Maybe I can have a bigger house. You think those things are going to take care of your kid and not God? Aren't we Christians? Shouldn't you be trusting in God? Saying, okay, well, we have God here. I can have more kids because I have God in my life and God can take care of our kids. No, I can't afford it. That is almost always the answer that a lot of that young couples give for why they aren't having kids. Think about that. What are they trusting in? Elder boards. Now, I don't know if you've examined the elder board at your church, but I've been to quite a few. So almost always the richest men in the congregation. Am I right? I mean, and they're the ones that have been tithing the most, right? The ones that have been contributing the most. They almost always get into these positions. Is that really biblical? Is that what you should be doing? It's usually the older guys that pay the most. Is that how it should be? Missions. Most of Christian missions ends up being almsgiving and not actually spreading the gospel. And I've seen this over and over, right? Like it's you go to a poorer country, the biggest need that they have is financial. And that's what gets focused on. It isn't about, hey, do you know Jesus Christ? Do you know that you're a sinner? Do you know that you can have eternal life? It's, we need a well. We could use a school, right? It's like sort of like a laundry list of things. And this is what missions has. There's this conflation of almsgiving and missions. Now, I'm not saying almsgiving is bad. I think building wells in Africa is great. And I think building schools in India is great. I think all of those things are awesome. But it's not missions. That's almsgiving. The last one, the next one in the trusting in money thing is that there's an air of being nice, right? And this largely happens in a lot of churches because that's the culture that they want to set. Why? Because they trust in money. They need your income. So what ends up happening is that there's a culture of niceness. When I read like the Gospel of John and I see how Jesus talked to people, I don't get the sense that, he was necessarily nice all the time. In fact, he was horribly offensive, right? You have to drink my blood and eat my flesh. Jesus, that's kind of you kind of sound like a cannibal. It's a really hard teaching. You sure about this? You have to drink my blood and eat my flesh. And it says in John 6 that like most of the people just kind of left him, right? How many churches do you think could give a word like that today? They can't. They can't financially. Scale in the church. You have the mega church phenomenon. It's a fiat phenomenon. You didn't have churches this big. And if you did, it grew very, very slowly over centuries, not over like a period of 10 years. And a lot of these churches are operated like businesses, right? Fiat businesses at that. And it's very much about making sure that the income and staff and everything is good. And you get celebrity pastors, much like celebrity CEOs, they're usually the best salesmen. They can get butts in seats, right? That's their focus. And you get lots of feel-good sermons because they want you to come back. There's very little challenging going on, which if you read Jesus' words, he's doing all the time, right? Go give everything you have to the poor and then come follow me. And the result is a shorter life cycle because a lot of these churches are extremely fragile. Because when you get to a certain scale and something goes wrong, well, you're not going to exist as a church much longer. I don't want to make it sound like all mega churches are bad. I think there are some that are very good and so on. But this is the value of fiat that's sort of penetrated the church. It's scale over quality. It's not about relationships with people. It's about getting a big building and having as many people as possible. And it's popped up all over America. And of course, outsourced virtue. And this is not just a fiat phenomenon. Political phenomenon. There's basically no cross-carrying expected, right? Just give us money and we'll have somebody else carry the cross, right? We'll have somebody else do the work, the hard work, right? You can just sit with your latte in your seat and sing a couple of songs. That's good enough for us. As long as you give us the money, we'll do the real hard work. And again, you get credit for group achievements. How many times do you go to church and they're like, you know what we did this weekend, guys? We went to this food bank and fed 30 people, and you guys made it all happen. It's all you, right? You didn't do anything. You gave them money. You didn't do anything. So money becomes a substitute for virtue, for actually doing the right thing. And ultimately, it's much more about signaling over obedience. It's about signaling with your money instead of obeying with your heart. And not surprisingly, people don't grow in these places because, once again, you have your latte, you sit in your seat, you sing a couple of praise songs, and you go home. How is that going to change your life? So what are some of the consequences? Well, we've covered some of them already, but let's look at it. So debt-based building means that, churches become the building and not the body of Christ, right? You read through the New Testament, most of these churches met in someone's homes. But you have this huge investment into a building, well, not a surprise that the building becomes the focus. And I used to live in Massachusetts, and we were trying to look for a building for our church. And my pastor literally went through all of Cambridge and found every church building that was in the area just to see, who they were, what they did. Almost all of them were Unitarian. They were kind of like a cancer. Like if you get like one Unitarian person in there, and you can vote as a majority to turn whatever congregation Unitarian, but to turn away from Unitarian to something else, you have to get unanimity. So one vote could prevent it. But the buildings become the prize. And Unitarians have way more buildings in the city of Boston than any other congregation. Right? That's not the church. But we make it the church when we make this capital project. We trust in money and we pour all of these resources into it. A lot of churches become leveraged like fiat businesses, and again, they have to act like it, right? Instead of giving you a challenging sermon on how to be more virtuous, how to be more like Christ, they'll give you a spiritual gift inventory, right? Like, oh, tell me more about me, right? Like, okay, and let's do a parenting seminar, and how to put your infants to bed. Those aren't bad things per se, but a church should be a church. It should be much more about Christ and your own holiness. There's very little patience and savings in a lot of these churches. Now, I can't necessarily blame them because fiat money is all they know. So if they keep it in dollars, then after 7 years, about half of it will be inflated away from them. So no one's going to keep money for 10 years. If they do, then now you have to have another, set of people that just do the investments on the savings you have. It's a lot of work. But there's very little patience for that. So, instead, when you're fragile, you look for ways to get government funding or like cut costs elsewhere. So you get a lot of tax deductible stuff as a religious organization. But we saw during COVID, a lot of churches took PPP loans. You can go look this up. And I did for Austin, right? And every major church I looked up got a PPP loan, which you didn't have to pay back, right? What happened to separation of church and state? Christians complain all the time about government intrusion into the church, but in this case, they invited it. You can't complain about it if you're inviting it in. So as a result, a lot of churches end up serving the money. And think about the phrase when you have to service debt, right? You're servicing debt. You're serving money. So this is a situation that we get into, and of course, they're incredibly fragile because if you can't pay off your mortgage and half your congregation leaves in a church split or something, church is going to die. All right? And the biblical model is of a mustard seed that grows over a long period of time. Instead, these are more like the weeds, right? Sprout up, go away. All right, trust in money. There's an orientation towards congregational size. A lot of churches end up going towards bigger and bigger because they want to hire more and more staff so they could do more ministry. Every decision is a financial decision because their main income is congregants, right? Not really depending on God. It's a consumer-oriented thing. And that's where it ends up, is that the church is there to serve you as a consumer. You're not there to serve God. And it largely ends up with an internal focus. I kind of made fun of the spiritual gift inventories that every small group seems to be obsessed with. It's tell me more about me. Okay? And instead of an external focus, which is all through the New Testament, it's about spreading the word and going out. And there's no real challenge. It's very easy, right? You're not asked to do anything difficult. You're just asked to, again, sip a latte in your seat while you sing a couple songs every Sunday. That's all they want. They as long as you're tithing or whatever, they don't really care. Scale over quality. When you scale, you become more of a machine than a body. Right? And what I mean by that is instead of organic connections that any natural body needs, it's very formal. Right? And I don't know about you, but whenever I visit a mega church, this is exactly what it feels like. Even checking in my kids. Oh, here are the stickers for your kids, and we have to keep track of all of them, and we do these trainings for all of the childcare workers and make sure that they're not sexual predators and all this. I'm like, okay, Where's the community in all this? It feels very formal. It feels very much like a business. What's going on? And yet, not surprisingly, cookie cutter Christianity, because this is what Scale is very good at, is producing the same of everything. And this is especially difficult in a lot, like as an Asian, right? Like this is like conformity is very tempting. But if you read the New Testament, right? We are the body of Christ. You're supposed to be different. A hand is not an eye. A foot is not a liver, right? There are all these different functions. You're supposed to grow more different as you grow closer to Christ. And unsurprisingly, there's a lot of like sort of fiat things that enter into a church as a result. A lot of gatekeeping, right? Oh, you're not allowed to do this, right? Like because we don't think it'll work, or we're not giving you permission yet, or you're not high enough or you haven't been attending this church long enough. It's a lot of centralization. You have to go through finance or legal or something, right? Whenever you want to do something, there's bureaucracy, a lot of red tape around anything that you want to do. These are natural consequences of Scale, and it's very inhuman, right? It's very non-organic. It feels like a machine. And they end up feeling like religious country clubs. I got this phrase from an Orthodox friend. And this is their criticism of Protestants, is all their churches are religious country clubs. And man, did that hurt. Why? Because I think all of you kind of guessed it. It's kind of true, right? It's about your comfort. It's not about God. And this is what Scale does, is it makes it more about you. It's very hyper efficient at getting, sort of harvesting a part of your income. Outsourced virtue, missions industrial complex. This is not something that I knew about until I met with a bunch of missionaries, right? And this is how they described it, as the current missions organizations is a missions industrial complex. Now, if you're not familiar with this term, this is from Eisenhower back in the 50s. As his last act as president, he warned of the military industrial complex, that there's this huge bureaucracy that is probably taking, and he said this as a general. He's like, dude, this is happening. Missionaries are calling it the missions industrial complex. There's a giant bureaucracy that's focused on the money, right? And if you've ever given support to a missionary, usually they're like, okay, you have to go through my organization and you have to earmark it to me so that they can pay their overhead and then I can get my money and all that. And this is a way to sort of like stay compliant or something like that. It's a huge problem. Why? Because now those missions organizations are the gatekeepers of all missionaries. If you want to go, you have to go with an organization. There's a lot of external approval without internal change. Again, it's like a group-based thing. So you get a lot of external approval because you go to a church that does all this stuff. We have a celebrating recovery, and we have the homeless ministry and this other stuff. Well, okay, now I get credit, right? I get external approval because my church does all of these things, but the internal change is never happening. Why? Because, again, you're sipping lattes, singing a couple songs every Sunday, and that's all you're doing. And sadly, service to money is recast as service to God. And this is one of the most egregious examples of idolatry. It's particularly bad like in the prosperity gospel. But I think most churches have some degree of this where, okay, like if you just give money, that's good. Or they emphasize it. And finally, we become enslaved to money and instead of Christ. And it's no wonder Christians are so ineffective. Because if you're enslaved to money, well, no one can have two masters. All right, so giving you a lot of depressing thoughts about church and so on. Hopefully I could cheer you up a little bit, because thank God for Bitcoin, right? This is the way we can get out of a lot of this rut. So Bitcoin, unfortunately, I messed up on the slide there, but Bitcoin is deflationary. That means that you can't have debt-based building. It has to be savings-based building. Now, you can have debt, but it forces opportunity costs for somebody else. And that's okay. If you're part of the congregation and you want to lend the church money or something like that, that can totally work. But savings-based building does not steal from anybody, right? The debt-based building we're talking about in the fiat economy, you're essentially stealing from everyone else through inflation. So it's on a much more solid basis. It's also decentralized, right? There is no monetary authority, which means that instead of trusting in money, you trust in God. It's also value storing. And that means that you don't have to scale. You don't have to keep getting bigger. And it's apolitical, so you can focus on real virtue instead of outsourced virtue. All right, so let's look at some of these. So savings-based building means that it's going to require a lot more patience from churches. And this has historically been the case in the Christian church. If you go to any cathedral in Europe and you find out when it was built or how long it took, a lot of them took like 100, 200 years, right? That was the level of patience that they had. There are churches in the U.S. that are upset if you don't like go to a new building like every 5 years until you get to mega church size, right? Like what's going on? Also leaves open room for God's timing. And I currently go to a church that started meeting during the pandemic. And this was a church where a bunch of people got together because their church wasn't meeting, and they decided to just meet in somebody's backyard. It's only 2 years old, but we somehow have a new building without any debt and $2 million in the bank. Now, it was a series of miraculous events that basically did that. But this is what you need to leave room for. Because too many churches depend on their congregants and their congregants' incomes. They don't trust in God. If God wants you to have something, He will give it to you. And you don't need to extort your congregants to do it. There's also resilience to shock, right? You're building on the solid rock. You're building on savings. If you have savings, well then, something like the pandemic hits, you can keep going, right? If you're not in debt, you're not always kind of fragile to different events. And you can be compliant to God instead of the government, instead of taking PPP loans or relying on tax deductions or, favorable zoning treatment by your local board. You can depend on God. You can trust God. You don't have to have everything right away. It's much more about God and less about you. Second, with Bitcoin, you can trust in God. And that means that we can focus on obedience and transformation instead of trusting in money, right? Because too many people think, okay, well, more money in this ministry will solve something. No, it doesn't. Obedience will solve it. Transformation into Christ-likeness will solve it. That is the entire message of the New Testament. If you have a problem, you need to obey and you need to transform. And it's God-focused, God-oriented, instead of money-oriented. You're not always thinking about the finances. It is about what God wants. And that external focus of looking outward instead of, okay, let's make sure everyone's comfortable and feel safe, instead, what does God want? That's that's where churches should be. And that's where you can be. That means that a lot more people are bold and courageous instead of just nice. Right? A lot of the niceness is just sort of cowardice. And you can have challenging words at the pulpit. You can challenge your congregation. You can be challenged to be more like Christ. And if some people get offended, that's okay. Right? We're so afraid to offend because they might leave along with the tithes that they get. Quality over scale. So have a real body and real community, and you're growing organically instead of based on debt. And you're not scaling very quickly, instead you're growing organically. Right? A lot of house churches have this sort of dynamic. A lot of your small groups, if you've been in them, have that dynamic. And you have much more of a decentralized ministry because you don't need permission, right? Like somebody wants to go try something, they just kind of do it instead of needing the money from the central organization that's like running everything. And people do it from their own savings. You're generally going to have smaller congregations. There's a lot of evidence that, 150 or about Dunbar's number is like the optimal size. Past that, you don't know everybody. And it's organic, it's permissionless. That means that anyone can kind of start it up. This is how Christianity started. It started in somebody's house, right? Like a lot of churches didn't have big buildings. It was okay. And we have a true priesthood of all believers. Right now, a lot of Christianity is centralized. If you don't have a MDiv from a seminary, no one listens to you. But you look at the Old Testament, all the prophets that were there. A lot of them did not come through the existing religious order. Like they were shepherds, they were random people. They just obeyed God. I believe there's a lot of people that could be doing ministry that aren't, because they don't have the right degrees or the right permissions or the right, they've been gate kept out of it. You could unleash that. All right, real virtue. Well, start preaching the gospel and not almsgiving. This is an unfortunate sort of conflation that we've had under fiat money. That goes away. Focus much more on transformation into Christ-likeness instead of signaling that we did this and that. It's about actual people doing real things that obey God's word. And the money starts to serve us instead of the other way around. When we have a really good savings vehicle, that's your dry powder. You can use it to take different opportunities. That's how money should be. But instead, we end up serving it because it demands so much of our attention. It's kind of like a spoiled toddler or something. And we can be enslaved to Christ instead of enslaved to money. No one can serve two masters. We can serve the actual master that we need to be serving. Anyway, I want to leave you with a little bit of application. At least in the sermon writing class that I took at church, I was told that this is the most important part. So let's go through a little bit of application. So number one, if you're in debt, get out of debt. You're stealing. And you're building on what is described as a sandy foundation, right? The winds come, the storm comes, you're going to get wrecked because you're very fragile under debt. If you have savings, you're more building on the solid rock. Trust and obey. Trust and obey, right? There's a tendency to trust in money. If I just make more money, I can do this. If I just make more money, I can do that. And I can take care of this. I can do this. No, it's not about money. Trust and obey Christ. Provide value. So I think this one is fairly self-explanatory, but one of the things that you and one of the ways in which you change as you obey Christ more is that you actually become the kind of person that people want to hire, right? You have integrity. You show up on time, right? You're not like crazy or doing drugs or something, right? Like you're somebody that people want to hire, and you can provide more value. And if you focus on that, well, you'll naturally make more money. And you can then develop virtue, right? Like cultivate all of this stuff. Like so few of us are that patient or, have a courage or, have a good sense of justice and act on it. So you can. But we need to take these fiat values out. And unfortunately, the church is currently really infected with that. Thankfully, there's Bitcoin. And I believe that as we go away from a fiat standard, and it's not that like Bitcoin is holy or something. I'm not saying that Bitcoin is Jesus, right? Like it's not that. It's that when you remove fiat money from the equation, a lot of God's intentions come through, right? You're not mucking the clear waters of the gospel. All right, I think that's it. Let's take a few minutes for our questions. Yeah.
I think I see one fly in the ring.
Okay.
When I see Bitcoin, I see Bitcoin mining, which consumes huge amounts of electricity and has significant environmental impact.
Mm-hmm.
How can Christian people that care about beautiful great planet that God gives us want to focus on a currency that consumes ever more electricity as people mine Bitcoins?
Okay. So a lot of the statistics around Bitcoin's energy usage is completely made up. So the papers that do it, those are very flawed. So they take the worst numbers and multiply them across. There's no way that you know what miner in China that's using a hydroelectric dam, how much energy that they've actually consumed. So at a first order level, those reports, I would be a little more wary of just sort of like swallowing their propaganda to some degree. Second, Bitcoin mining goes to where the energy is cheapest. So generally, it's the least wanted energy. So energy is not completely transportable across space very easily. I can't run this computer from a hydroelectric dam in China, which has significant capacity. I have to use the local. So if you actually look at how it affects the environment and so on, it's actually good for the environment because you have less gas flaring. Right? If you're drilling an oil well, there's natural gas that comes with the oil well, and according to EPA standards, if you let that methane go up into the atmosphere, that's illegal because that's a huge environmental impact. So you burn it off and release carbon dioxide instead, which is still bad, but not as bad as nothing. So by using Bitcoin mining, there's a bunch of entrepreneurs doing exactly this. They use that energy and basically emit nothing. You put it essentially into something like a muffler. Now, the other thing that I would caution against is this idea that, okay, energy usage is bad. Because there's a lot of other usages of energy that are happening all the time that are actually really good for civilization. Right? You have dryers, for example, that take up way more energy than Bitcoin. Now, are you having the same thing with dryer manufacturers saying, you know what, you guys, this is a fly in your ointment, like we shouldn't adopt dryers because they use way too much energy, or Christmas lights, right? Oh, you guys shouldn't be putting up Christmas lights and celebrating Jesus. No, like that's using way too much energy. Energy usage has always been correlated with higher human productivity. This is why we don't need to till our own fields anymore. It's because you have gasoline, highly efficient, tractors and things that can till a field very quickly and efficiently. So I mean, this is a pretty deep topic, and it's there are literally hundreds of articles online to talk about it specifically. I would encourage you to go read some of those if you're especially concerned about it. But Bitcoin mining is no worse for the environment than a lot of other things, and I actually think it's better for the environment. Jeff?
So what about cryptocurrency scams? So there's 20,000 plus different cryptocurrencies, altcoins, 95% of them are scams or failed ventures.
They're all scams.
As a Christian, we're associating ourselves with this, and same thing even in Bitcoin as it's been used for malicious hacking of medical companies and things like this. Should we as Christians even be associated with this?
Yeah, interesting that you bring that up, because altcoins are scams, and they are sort of like conflated with Bitcoin in a lot of ways. But honestly, that's not something we can help, right? In the Bitcoin space, if people suddenly sort of latch on and like conflate that together, that's not really our problem. It's the problem of these other people that are doing the conflating. Now, specifically with respect to altcoins, there's a large incentive on the part of the people that are producing these altcoins to associate themselves with Bitcoin, because Bitcoin has 15 years of history, it's gone up significantly. So the thing that they want you to think is, we're the next Bitcoin, and you can do this however many X or whatever. But of course they're not. They're completely centralized. They don't have any of these properties that I talked about. As far as like stuff like ransomware and other things that are sort of darknet markets and things like that, there are people that are going to use that. But you know what? Christianity had the same thing at the beginning. Like there were rumors that Christians were eating babies or drinking blood and things like that. Maybe there were some cults that did that, but just because we have that association doesn't mean that it's our fault. These are sort of things that opponents do. This is what an enemy this is what your enemy does. It's not something that you can necessarily help. Now, I do believe that as Christians we should be refuting all of these slanders against these things, just like you would if you were living in Roman times and you had these rumors. But is there anything I'm not sure if there's any moral imperative to say try to go and change everybody, or to go away from it. It's not something that you can control as a Christian, right? Other people's perception of a particular thing. So. Kind of let them continue in their error until they figure out that what the truth actually is. Yeah.
So when you refer to savings, and we should be saving more, and so your preferred saving method would be Bitcoin and not. So, but I don't earn a living in Bitcoin. I earn a living in U.S. dollars. So, what you're proposing is I take those U.S. dollars, put them into Bitcoin as a store of value.
That's correct. Yeah, and I believe that's going to be better for most people. Obviously, there's short-term fluctuations, and if you happen to catch it at the wrong time, you might come out a little bit behind. But over the long term, this is a long-term savings vehicle. It's been fantastic. Anyone that's held for 5 years has at least made money in dollars. And in a lot of there's at least 20 currencies right now where Bitcoin is at an all-time high. So those people at this moment, they've not. If you're still holding Bitcoin in those countries, you haven't lost money in terms of those currencies. Now, that said, U.S. dollar has inflated. There's no meter, right? Money is supposed to be that meter where you can sort of measure other things. We don't really have that because the meter keeps changing, at least in terms of the dollar, because they keep printing more of it, or contracting it during like high interest rate times and so on. So, but yeah, I believe Bitcoin to be the best savings vehicle out there.
So how far out do you think we are from Bitcoin being used to buy a house or to buy a car or to go to Kroger?
Well, I mean, you can do all of those things right now in certain places. Right? And my friend CJ has a dealership in California to go buy a car right now, and Bitcoin will gladly take it. And there are real estate transactions that happen with Bitcoin all the time. And they're not common, but you can do it. You just need to make sure that whoever is doing the brokering kind of knows what's happening. And certainly you can get like bit refill gift cards and go shop at Kroger with it. It's a little bit of a pain, but you can do it. At least in El Salvador, it's like much easier because a lot of them just take it on straight. Now, how long is it going to take for a majority of those places to do it? I don't know. It's hard to tell because the side of the equation that's known is Bitcoin. We know what the supply will be forever. But what we don't know is the supply of U.S. dollars and when that hyperinflation is triggered, or if it gets triggered in the next 50 years or whatever, or if there's going to be a revaluation or a different currency or whatever. Those are the unknowns, and those are much more important to how it actually plays out than anything else.
All right. Well, we want to thank Jamie for this presentation. It was amazing. It was fantastic. That is a lot of on the sentence.